Alright guys, it's been a while since we had some real content for the Warhammer trilogy. We're going on, I think, 4 months now since the Queen and the Crown dropped, and it's about that time that we start talking some more about what the next campaign pack will be. We don't know much about it yet, other than the fact that it will have 4 legendary lords, and that it will be dropping sometime between now and the end of the year. But considering some of the posts they've made on Reddit, and the fact that December is usually vacation time for Creative Assembly, I think we'll be getting it at least before New Year's Eve, which should make many of you very, very happy. But in this video, we're going to talk about the minor factions that have a shot at making it in. Basically just weigh the pros and cons of each, what they would bring to the table, what makes them unique and special, and why I think some of those choices are clearly better than others. Mortal Empires has definitely shaped up to be a whale of a campaign. I'll be honest in saying that I've still never completed a full Mortal Empires playthrough, and frequently, I won't even make it far enough to experience the Chaos Invasion firsthand. I've always found the beginning stages of empire building a lot more interesting than the later stages, and I think this is a problem that pretty much every strategy game on the planet deals with in some capacity, and that there comes a point where painting the map becomes a chore rather than actually being fun, and when I reach that point, I'm usually just like, I'm done with this, I'm going to take a break, or I'll move on to the next one. But it's a behemoth. It is a monstrous campaign with a ton of flavor and a lot of love put into it that's an absolute joy to experience in many different facets. One thing that it is lacking though are fleshed out minor factions. And if you're well versed in the lore, when you march onto Leia or Estalia, or conquer the frozen tundra on your way to Kislev, it feels kinda weird to run into Empire clones there. The novels and army books make it very clear they're distinct cultures. The source material makes it very clear they have their own standing armies, with their own accents and their own languages and their own people, and so it's less than ideal to see these vibrant and interesting regions of the campaign map kind of fall by the wayside and be largely ignored. You don't want to see Kislev as an Empire clone, because that's not what they are. So I think most of us can agree that some of these minor factions absolutely deserve their own time in the spotlight, and thankfully, come the end of the year, we'll be getting one. Now, should it be coming before the Lizardmen and Skaven get their Lord pack? No, not in the slightest, but we can save that conversation for another time. The question is, which minor faction will be getting fleshed out? When we look at a map of the Great Vortex, there are a ton of minor factions that could easily fit right in. The Amazons of Lustria, the Fen Beasts and Mystic Druids of Albion, the Zombie Pirates of the Vampire Coast, the Whirling Dervishers of Araby, and of course, the Explorers of Telea, Astalia, and the Border Princes come to claim the New World for their own. The frontrunners, in my opinion, I've shared this before, are far and away the Southern Realms, dropping alongside their Dogs of War. From my point of view, they easily clear every hurdle that might block their inclusion in the game. Do they have a ton of named characters with lore and special rules that fit into the legendary Lord archetype? Yes, more than enough. Borgio the Besieger, Midas the Mean, Lucrezia Belladonna, Marco Colombo, El Cadavo, Lightpole the Black, Gashnag the Black Prince, and many others. Do they have an official army book from Games Workshop? Yeah, they do. Their Dogs of War mercenaries are incredibly well fleshed out, with decades of lore behind them, special rules, and a cohesive backstory that marks them as mercenaries for hire. Would they be popular? Yes, I certainly think so. If we've learned anything from both Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2, it's that people love that with which they are familiar. There's a reason the Empire and the High Elves are the 2 most popular races in their respective games, and it's because they are straightforward, they're very versatile, and they play closely to what a traditional faction from historical Total Wars plays like. New players instinctively gravitate towards what they know and understand the best, and there's something undeniably awesome about watching simple men with pikes and gunpowder blast away the horrors of the warp and evil rodents from beneath the earth. That's something the Southern Realms and the Dogs of War can offer in spades, with some additional flavor and a whole lot of Warhammer goodness to sweeten the pot. After all, there aren't a lot of people who don't want to see Birdman of Katraza fly around the battlefield with Renaissance-style winged contraptions raining death from above. Who doesn't want to see noble dragon riders from Calador fight alongside regimented formations of pikemen and thundering cannons? Who doesn't want to see some of the most famous regiments of renown in the entire setting hit the battlefields of Total War Warhammer 2? If you're a Warhammer fan, the Dogs of War have a lot to offer, and if you're not, they still do. If you like pike and shot warfare, they're going to be right up your alley. They're kind of just a perfect blend of both the old world and the new, combining exploration, expeditions, and conquest in the jungles of Lustria with the fancy hats, explosive weaponry, and can-do spirit of the world that was. They have a lot going for them, whether you like the race or not, and because their mercenary system would combine highlights from many different races as well, you're getting a faction that really kind of encompasses much of what makes Warhammer so special and unique. You're not just getting humans, you're getting a melting pot of many different things that make the universe so great. But they're far from the only choice that Creative Assembly has on the table. Now, these next minor factions are, I think, quite a bit less likely than Dogs of War for a multitude of reasons that we'll cover, but they still definitely have a shot. CA seems to have quite a bit of latitude with Games Workshop. I think if there's been anything that's been really surprising about this entire trilogy, it's how much latitude they actually have. The devs have already established that they have a good grasp on the IP, and they've already gone way beyond what most of us would have ever thought possible, or what we would have ever thought they'd be allowed to do when they first signed that contract with Games Workshop. There's probably not a person on the planet who would have thought we'd be getting anything remotely like Norska when that first contract was signed. But they came, and they were awesome, and I think there's going to be more crazy stuff on the way. So we've established Creative Assembly and Games Workshop can do stuff that's outside the box, which means the minor faction stuff can be outside the box as well. Now for this next race, there are a ton of obstacles to break through before they ever get a shot at becoming playable, but their aesthetic, their location, and their interactions with the races of the Great Vortex campaign still make them a possibility. The Vampire Coast, a race we first talked about in our overview of Lustria video a year and a half ago with, I think, Lore Master of Sotek. And on the one hand, they have a really well fleshed out roster from White Dwarf magazine, which I think is something that a lot of people overlook. Their roster is surprisingly well fleshed out. They also had a supplement in the Conquest of the New World expansion book. And that's important because it means that CA simply has to do less hard work to get them visually represented in the game, because they have inspiration and a solid baseline to work from and build off of. On the other hand, they've got some serious issues. For starters, I'm not even sure they have 4 Legendary Lord characters that are worthy of actually fleshing out to that fullest potential. Luther Harkin, Blood of Ancient Lamia, is obviously a given. He is the reason they're even a faction in the first place. And Count Noctilus, Master of the Dread Fleet, is the other. He went by the name Nicholas von Karstein and even has an event blurb in Total War's campaign. And those two are clear-cut. I mean, if a Vampire Coast faction ever got made, they would for sure be in. But after that, there's really not much to go on at all. In fact, the only other named character I can possibly think of is Captain Drekla, right hand of Luther Harkin, but he's a footnote. He has pretty much no entries in the lore at all, other than that people know he exists. I think he might be mentioned a couple times in the end times, but he really doesn't offer anything unique from a gameplay point of view that Count Noctilus or Luther Harkin wouldn't already offer. And yeah, from a gameplay perspective and from an aesthetic perspective, he's basically a carbon copy. Like, there's nothing unique about him at all that I can think of. So I think it's really hard to argue for his inclusion, which leaves 2 open spots that I have absolutely no idea how to fill. Remember, it's a campaign pack. Campaign pack means 4 Legendary Lords, and all of those will be fleshed out. Like, how do you make those characters? Are CA just going to make them up? Are they going to be some backroom characters that maybe Games Workshop held on to for a long time that they never made officially playable or known about? Like, how is CA going to draw that inspiration? How are they going to get those 2 slots filled? That's a big question. That is a big hurdle for the Vampire Coast to try to vault over. Because to the best of my knowledge, we have no precedent for something like that, right? Legendary Lords are obviously a huge part of these DLCs. They're one of the main selling points. They're always going to be a really important component of it, and CA have not, to the best of my knowledge, created one from scratch yet. So, I don't know. I think that's the biggest hurdle the Vampire Coast have right now, how CA decides to handle that, if they ever decide to tackle them. And then, of course, there's the whole naval battle element, too, which is kind of the same issue I have with Lokir Felhart. Any naval-focused faction, period, whether it be the Kraken Lord and the Tower of Blessed Dread for the Dark Elves, or Count Noctilus and the Bloody Reaver's Dread Fleet, is kind of wasted in a game without naval battles, right? Like, their entire aesthetic is just straight up Curse of the Black Pearl. Undead pirates who sail the roiling seas and recruit sea monsters like Krakens and leviathans and other water-going monstrosities to do their bidding. Can you translate that to a land-based faction? Sure, but you lose a lot of the flavor that made them special in the first place. For the High Elves and Dark Elves, even though they are clearly naval powerhouses and that's not really represented very well in Total War Warhammer 2, their rosters are clearly designed for fighting on land. Their lore and their military and their empires are still land-based. Well, when you're talking pirates, an entire roster of them, and sea monsters, then it gets even weirder that we don't have a naval solution, that we don't have naval battles. And then of course there's the whole vampire fatigue thing. I don't personally have that issue, but a lot of people hated the fact that the vampire accounts got so much love in Game 1, and I think we need both Neferata and Nagash before this series wraps up. So there's going to be even more undead stuff on the way. They're too important to skip. So it would be kind of a nightmare if some random undead minor faction in Lustria got fully fleshed out, but one of the most important and unique vampire characters in the setting, and the single biggest threat to the Warhammer world outside the Forces of Chaos in Nagash, never got included. That would be a catastrophe for a lot of people. So yeah, it would be really bizarre to get Vampire Coast but not Nagash. So I don't know, that part is weird too. But if we take a look at their roster from the White Dwarf, their fierce rivalry with the Lizardmen, and most importantly their location in a kind of empty spot on the Vortex campaign map, you might see why they're worth a look. They've got some crazy over-the-top Warhammer goodness on their roster. I mean, just a quick peruse on Warhammer Wiki, and you've got bloated corpses, zombie gunners, fell bats who drop zombies into the middle of enemy formations, tons of ridiculous artillery options like a jerry-rigged cannon the size of a house, leviathans, crab monsters, krakens, lots of other stuff. There's more than enough there to make a playable and really colorful faction. And the two legendary lords they do have, Count Noctilus and Luther Harkin, have plenty of lore and flavor you can pick from their companion texts in Dreadfleet and the End Times. They're pretty well fleshed out, and Luther Harkin makes a pretty big impact in the End Times, so they have stuff going for them for sure. Overall, I'd say they have a significantly smaller chance than Dogs of War, but they have plenty of potential there. There's lots of stuff there that would be worth fleshing out, if for no other reason that Lustria needs more playable start positions. Part of that will be fixed with Lizardman Free LC. Maybe if CA wants to get crazy, they can put a Dark Elf down there too, but this would definitely help out with the kind of barren Lustria that we have right now. Obviously, other stuff like Conquistador expeditions, in the New World colonies, Vampire Coast itself, the Amazons, all that stuff could make an impact there, and we'll talk about Amazons in a bit. But right now, let's talk about Araby. We've talked about them before, but it was a while ago, so I want to kind of rehash a few of those things and discuss what's good about them and why they might not make it, why they might make it. And I'd say they are completely on par with where the Vampire Coasts are at right now, with a lot of the same issues and a lot of the same hints that make their inclusion possible. For one, they've got an awesome start location, a perfect tie-in to the old world with their intense rivalry with Bretonnia, and they have close proximity to the island of Sartosa, which I consider as kind of a jump-off point between Mortal Empires and the Great Vortex campaign. It's an important stronghold in the war for New and Old World, and Araby is right there to contest it and be the bridge between New and Old. But they will really struggle heavily to flesh out 4 legendary lords without making stuff up. Sultan Jafar is long dead, although CA could totally bring him back if they wanted to, and the Golden Magus is another Dreadfleet character who could be an awesome addition with his Flaming Scimitar ship, powerful spellcasting, and control over Jinn, which are the ethereal deities and demons of his homeland. But while there's a ton of Warhammer goodness there, after that, where do you go? Like, how do you fill those empty Lord slots? It's the exact same problem the Vampire Coast have. There simply are not many characters to draw from, and there's not a lot of lore either. They're a footnote in novels and army books, and yet their inclusion would add some really nice Eastern flair to the Great Vortex campaign that it's seriously lacking right now. And if historical Total Wars are anything to go by, Persian, Parthian, Egyptian, and Turkish factions are frequently played and frequently loved. And throw in some 1001 Nights mysticism, throw in some flying carpets, some war elephants, and demonic genies, and you've got yourself a fantastic unit roster that's unlike anything we've seen in this trilogy. Hashashin are right there as well. So there's a lot of stuff going for it. But the last race was Tomb Kings. Do CA really want to go for another sand-based faction in the same area of the world. Whether it's fair or not, I think a lot of people will consider that there's a fair amount of overlap between the two. Even though their rosters are quite distinct, even though one is obviously human-based with a little bit of gunpowder and a lot of Egyptian and Turkish and Persian influences, which is not to say anything like what the Tomb Kings have, but I think a lot of people would look at it and say there's a lot of similarities there, and basically just say there's a rough aesthetic and regional location similarity that I don't want to deal with. I don't want to buy two sand factions back to back, which I would understand from a casual perspective. So they've got a fully fleshed out Warhammer list. They've got some really cool unique elements, and they're a really nice blend of historical and fantasy, and they're human. As I've already said, that really does appeal to a lot of casual and hardcore fans. So they tick a lot of boxes that make them worth pursuing, but they also tick a lot of boxes that make them maybe not so much. So I personally think that they could be a lot more exciting than the Vampire Coast if done right. I think that if CA gave them the full fleshing out treatment, that their upper bound is higher than where they could take the Vampire Coast. But overall, I'd say they have about the same shot at being the next campaign pack. Them and the Vampire Coast are neck and neck. Definitely possible, but with a sizable gap between them and the Dogs of War, which, as I've already said, is a couple heads above everything else right now. Now, for the next two minor factions, this is where I think we're stretching it a bit more, where they simply have less to go off of, where CA will have to pass the marijuanas around the table a bit more, get real imaginative to do a full-on campaign pack and actually do it justice. For the first three, there was a very decent amount to work with. For these next two, there's stuff to work with for sure, but definitely a whole lot less. For Albion and the Amazons, they've got some great elements, and they've still made their mark on the Warhammer world over and over again in the source material, and some of their stuff goes back decades. Literally, I'm talking like 2nd edition shenanigans. So it's not like they don't belong in the setting, and it's not like CA couldn't tackle them if they wanted. I just think it would be more challenging with less official stuff to work with. Of course, the cool thing about having a great working relationship with Games Workshop, though, is that they probably have entire Carracks filled with unused ideas that CA can draw inspiration from. So at any point, they could plop that down on the table and say, yo, check this out, homie. Blow their minds, do some crazy stuff. No one's ever heard of this, but we worked on this 20 years ago. Plop it out and do something cool with it. So that could totally be a thing. I'm not sure we've seen a whole lot of that yet, but as we move forward and there become less major and major factions, it could certainly become one. Now, I'll be honest, the Amazons are at the very bottom of my list in terms of playable factions that I would like to see. I don't hate their aesthetic. I mean, I've got nothing against good-looking half-naked girls who could rip my still-beating heart out of my chest. That's badass. But in terms of variety and overall flavor, I think they might be lacking to an extent. Now, the cool thing about Amazons is that in very early editions, they were essentially rocking 40k weaponry. There's literally official art of their Coca-Cola Devouts and Zealot Warriors using las pistols and stuff straight out of the Imperium of Man that came about 40,000 years later. We're talking laser weapons, automatic rifles, ridiculous stuff that harkens back to the coming of the old ones, or forwards to a time in the grim, dark, far future that got mucked up in some warp shenanigans and somehow got transported all the way back in time. Remember that early editions of Warhammer Fantasy were connected to 40k, and that Sigmar might have been a lost Primarch on a planet gripped by some kind of temporal anomaly. But a lot of things from that era of Warhammer obviously got retconned. Since that time, Sigmar has... that's not a thing. It's not a thing anymore, but it was. And so CA could still take elements of that and try to work it in. And so it is with the Amazons as well. They use old ones' artifacts like weapons, and so that element in and of itself could be amazing if it was actually done well. But there's definitely a part of me that says it would feel wrong to have Amazons making better use of the artifacts than the Lizardmen themselves. Obviously, they have the Beam of Chotek from the Solar Engine. They've got some of that stuff. They might get the Arc of Sotek as well. But at the end of the day, their roster is kind of bare bones. And to flesh it out really well, I feel like they'd have to use a lot of old ones' artifacts. And then that's kind of stealing the Lizardmen's thunder. So there's a bit of conflict there that I'm not really sure how to rectify. From White Dwarf Magazine, they do have a unit roster. There are a couple additions there that we can talk about. The Serpent Priestess with her own unique lore of the serpent that can lash foes with divine winds or summon tropical storms. They've got Queen's Bodyguard, Tribeswomen, berserkers, zealots, and an elite class that, as I said, wields high-age weaponry that are basically old ones artifacts that go pew pew and basically kill stuff. So there are cool elements there. Now, CA could easily go outside the box and work in some huge jungle serpents that ride as monstrous cavalry, add some magical artillery pieces, basically just ratchet up that girl power to the next level. That's totally a thing. There's tons of room to expand the faction, but I think that's part of the problem overall. There's so much room to expand the faction that the foundation itself really isn't all that spectacular. As I said, everything I listed right there is everything that ever got included in any kind of official capacity or ever got mentioned in any kind of lore blurb, army book, whatever. So there's not a whole lot there, and they'd have to go really outside the box to fully flesh it out. I think it could be done, and it could be done great, but purists would likely have a problem with it, and ultimately I think there are better options. If it meant we got to see some new dinosaur models though, like imagine something like Amazons riding Pachycephalosaurus into battle, or something like that, there are definitely a lot of ways to spice them up that would be really cool. Raptors and T-Rex are awesome for the lizardmen, we have those, but I wouldn't mind seeing the Amazons tame some other dinosaurs that we haven't seen yet, because there's a lot of beasts of Lustria that have not made it into the game in any official capacity. Now for Albion, this is a faction that had its own campaign and board game, Dark Shadows. It's a land shrouded in mist with tons of different creatures like fen beasts and giants, and basically crawling amphibia and other marsh-going monsters. Some of the lore is kind of a joke. I mean, GW literally takes Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul and called their dude Curious Geezer, and the invasion of this random scrub and his legions almost wiped them out and brought the whole island to its knees. Which doesn't say a whole lot for their military pedigree, right? Like, if they get conquered by a dude named Curious Geezer, their military is probably kind of a joke. But Albion does have an important role to play in the world at large. The Ogham circles that dot the island function much like waystones, so they siphon chaos energy towards the poles and drain the world of its magic, and it was also the site of Be'lakor's ascension into the material plane. At the Citadel of Lead, the Demon Prince began materializing and corrupting the Truesayers of Albion into his dark emissaries, who would then lure more chaotic forces to the island to help in his grand schemes. As we know, Be'lakor is a pretty big deal. I mean, he's called the Dark Master. He's the Demon Prince of Chaos Undivided, and considering there was an entire Warhammer campaign dedicated to this event at Albion, I'd say it has at least slight importance in the lore. In terms of an army roster, I'd argue there's more to work with here than even the Amazons, simply going off real-world mythology, but also with what they had in their supplement books as well. When you're talking about druids and fen beasts and that kind of thing, there's a lot of Celtic influence there, a lot of mystical creatures you can pull from both Arthurian legend and other earlier cultures as well. I'm trying to remember if it's Celtic or Celtic, I always get those confused. I think it's Celtic actually. But from the tabletop, they officially had Truesayers, descendants of the only humans to ever learn magic from the old ones themselves, druids who are heavily connected to nature and can often shapeshift into bears or other forest creatures, which of course we wouldn't get in Warhammer campaign, but they might be able to summon them or turn into them with some kind of spell or something. Unfortunately, Transformation of Kadan is a summon spell, so it'll probably be more of a summon, but I would love to see some kind of morphing spell at some point in the game. Could be really cool. But yeah, the fen beasts are gigantic swamp monsters of stone, rotted wood, and bone, and of course they also have giants as well, which is the last thing we need, but whatever. I mean, it might be cool to see a slightly more intelligent and nicer bearded version of a giant that's covered in blue war paint, but their culture is basically that of a Neolithic civilization. Bit of an oxymoron there, but picture barbarian cave dwellers covered in woad, rocking the Gallic and Iceni aesthetic of Rome 2, but a bit more on the wild man side, a bit more a bit earlier in history, as it were. So less metalworking, less armor, more Stone Age, but the same kind of overall aesthetic. I think giving Albion's roster its day in the limelight would be entirely possible, and even add an extra element to the Great Vortex campaign map that none of the other factions could, in terms of a landmass that gives map-wide bonuses for controlling it, in terms of harnessing the winds of magic. But drawing up 4 truly legendary Lord characters would be pretty challenging, again, for this faction. It'd be difficult for Vampire Coast, definitely difficult for Araby, almost impossible for Amazons, and quite challenging for Albion as well. I can't think of a single one of their named characters that even approaches being considered a minor force in the setting, much less a major one capable of leading an entire faction. But yeah, again, I think with these minor factions, one of them's going to get done, which means CA has to take the plunge. And if they don't do Dogs of War, something's getting made up. I don't know what it's going to be, but something will be. So the ultimate question, can and should CA make up characters if they're well written and reflective of established lore? Should minor factions that can't easily get 4 legendary lords be left in the dust when it comes to campaign packs simply because they can't fill that requirement, even if they have all the other required elements done? Or do you think they should be given a shot as long as the source material has enough there to make them an exciting and interesting faction? Lot to discuss there for sure. My personal order of what the next campaign pack should be goes to Dogs of War and Southern Realms, then Araby, then Vampire Coast, then Albion, then Amazons. But I'm curious what you all have to think about it. I think there's a lot to discuss there. Let me know which minor faction you want and which you think we'll be getting before the end of 2018. Let me know in the comment section below. See you all in the next video. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.